how did Askin defeat true Shikai Ichigo in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, all without taking a single scratch of damage? Well, it's all thanks to his unique Quincy ability, the Death Dealing, one of the deepest, most powerful abilities in the series. It can also be one of the most confusing too, certainly earlier on in the arc before Kubo clearly decided to streamline precisely how it works, but the fundamentals remain the same throughout. The foundation of Askin's Schrift is this. Using his power, Askin can poison his enemies, as well as grant himself immunity to certain attacks and abilities. But how exactly does the death dealing work? What makes this Schrift so powerful, so broken? And how does Askin use it to win so many battles, defeating a string of extremely powerful enemies one after the other, including, yes, Ichigo himself? Because it's true, he may not look the type, but Askin goes on something of a rampage at the end of the arc. Of course, Askin's entire character revolves around the idea of making himself seem small, unassuming, and certainly non-threatening, only to immediately turn the tables and effortlessly defeat his opponent, leaving them often on the brink of death. As the death dealer, Askin can tinker and toy with an enemy's life, all while empowering himself. Eventually, even characters who are considerably stronger than him, like Ichigo, can do nothing in the face of this ability. I also want to talk about how the death dealing is perceived by readers, especially early on, and how it seems like Kubo changed the way he depicted this ability in a pretty big way, turning it away from an issue that plagued a number of the Schrift, which was way too abstract, way too conceptual, and instead making it something much more akin to the usual shonen battle manga ability, something that's much more at home in a series like Bleach. So, how does Askin's Schrift, the Death Dealing, actually work? What does it do, and how does he use it to defeat Ichigo? Let's take a look. Of course, remember that if you enjoy Bleach content like this every single week, then check out the Patreon down in the description below. We can help support this channel every single month. It really does go a very long way, and it does help me out a lot. And of course, a huge thank you and a massive shout out to everyone who is supporting me over on Patreon, whose names are appearing on the credits right now. It does mean a lot. So, how does the death dealing work? To put it simply, Askin has complete control over lethal dose, the amount of something required to kill someone. By ingesting something, Askin then gains control over how it affects both himself and his opponent, and we see a few examples of this. The first example of Askin's Schrift being used in an actual readable way comes in chapters 601 and 602, where he fights Nimaya Oetsu. Now, to be totally honest, the way this Schrift was introduced was a bit of a convoluted mess. One of the biggest issues with this Schrift and its portrayal in the manga is how unnecessarily wordy Kubo decided to make its introduction. The entire first page of chapter 602 is basically one huge text wall. Now, I love reading, sure, but this isn't an ideal way to convey a brand new ability, and certainly not in a shonen battle manga. And when you really get into it, the craziest thing about this page too is that everything after the first half of text on here simply isn't necessary and only serves to muddy the waters. All you need to know is A, that Askin controls lethal dose, and B, what lethal dose means. Again, it's the amount of something required to kill someone. It's always felt to me like Kubo himself kind of realised this too. As the further into the arc we go, the more readable Askin's power becomes, and the less abstract and conceptual it is, the less drawn out his explanations. Here in chapter 602, Askin spends the entire chapter telling Oetsu what his power does, but there's very little to actually see on the page. Interestingly, way back in chapter 543, when Askin is properly introduced for the first time, he conjures a gift ball to distract Hashwolf and Basby. Yet a gift ball wouldn't be seen again until chapter 635, when Askin throws one at Grimjo to poison him. And it's really from this moment on that Askin's power becomes much more akin to your typical shonen ability on the page, and it's all the better for it, in my opinion. Anyway, back to chapters 601 and 602, what's actually happening here? It's a little weird because while the fundamentals are the same, like I said, Kubo kind of changes how Askin uses his powers on screen against Oetsu, and then much later against the likes of, say, Yoroichi and Yushiro. He doesn't change how they work, but he does change how they are demonstrated. Here in chapter 601, Oetsu seemingly kills Askin with a slash to the throat, but Askin survives the attack, telling the Zero Division member that he was chosen to join the Vandenreich in the first place because he simply wouldn't die, though we don't ever really learn what that means or what the circumstances were around that moment. However, knowing what we know now about Askin's power, we can surmise that because he survived Oetsu's first strike, he was able to accurately gauge whereabouts the swing would be, and unlike the rest of the Schutzstaffel, he manages to mostly dodge that initial attack. Because he survived it, he was able to then gain immunity to the Shinigami's power, and thus survived the second, supposedly fatal hit too. And thus from here, Askin is able to now poison Oetsu. Now it's interesting because Kubo chooses to show Askin using blood to poison Oetsu here, but Oetsu clearly feels the effects of the death dealing before Askin drinks any blood. After this, Askin collects and, like I said, begins to drink his own blood, as by ingesting something, he can then control that same element in his opponent, affecting the lethal dose of said element. So here against Oetsu, by drinking the blood he sustained from the wound on his throat, he can make it so that his target is then poisoned by their own blood, as Askin lowers the lethal dose of blood needed to kill Oetsu. Again, while I like this fight, and I like the death dealing, in fact it turns into one of my favourite Schrift, this does feel like the worst, most roundabout way Kubo could have introduced this ability. Before we continue, remember to hit subscribe down below if you enjoyed today's video. It does help me out a lot, and for you guys it is quick, it is easy, and it's totally free to do as well. We're on our journey to reach 300,000 subs, and it's only going to be possible, of course, with your help. So do please consider hitting subscribe down below today. If you enjoyed this video, if you're new here, if you just like getting Bleach content like this every single week, do help me out, it does mean a lot. So we've seen how the death dealing was used in the Royal Palace Assault, in the manga at least. Anyway, obviously things are a little different in the anime because Askin gets the early version of his Volsten dish. But the way the death dealing is used in Varvelt, the difference honestly feels like night and day, as Kubo streamlines the ability and makes it, frankly, more shonen. Flash forward to chapter 630, and then later chapter 656, and Askin has been given several abilities much more akin to the usual Bleach-style power set. He has the Gift Ball, which is essentially just a poisonous orb that he can throw at his enemies, and now in chapter 656, Gift Bad, a poisonous pool that infects those who stand in it. We're already moving away from the long-winded, ultra-wordy explanation that we got in chapter 602 to instead something that's much more digestible on the page. And I know this kind of sounds like it's reinforcing the old idea that Bleach fans and manga fans in general don't like to read their own series, but I promise you, this is mostly just an issue of how digestible the ability actually comes across. And like I said, Kubo himself clearly felt the same kind of way as he totally changes up how the death dealing is depicted. But you know, ultimately it boils down to the fact that now it is extremely obvious how the death dealing and its ability works here. And the thing is, Kubo still remains true to the core power at play. Askin is still lowering their tolerance to different things, to whatever he chooses. When Chad and Orihime step onto the Gift Bad, the Gift Bad itself isn't poisoning them, but it lowers their tolerance to whatever Askin designates, and here he chooses Reishi, as he knows they've been exposed to Varvelt's ultra-high Reishi density. Now I'll get into this distinction a little more later on, but it might already be obvious to you that the way Askin uses the death dealing offensively has been changed up somewhat considerably in its depiction. Now it's totally possible that he's still ingesting a large amount of the reishi around them because I guess he would have to be. But it's nowhere near as explicit as him literally drinking blood to affect his opponent, but we'll get into that in a minute. Not only is the introduction of Askin's individual abilities much more visually pleasing, but it also just makes more sense. And like I said, is much more digestible than a long spiel that doesn't utilize anything visual for the audience and the reader to latch onto. Now, to be totally fair, Askin does say to Chad and Orihime that when he normally tries to kill someone, he does so by ingesting a lot of whatever he wants to control, and it does show a flashback to him drinking blood. But it's also true that even beyond this, in Varvelt, when Askin is actively trying to kill characters like Yoruichi and Kisuke, he is never seen doing this again. He's never seen ingesting a substance like this to then use against them. Is it just down to him having too much cafe au lait even when his life is on the line? I guess it could be totally possible. And by the way, this particular issue, this is not unique to the death dealing. This is an issue that a lot of Schrift in particular have to grapple with, until we end up finding ourselves with Uryu versus Hashwolf, where it's the antithesis versus the balance, and there's nothing happening of any kind of visual acuity on the page itself. It's all abstract, it's all conceptual, and that was a little bit of a problem. Hell, at least when Hashwolf kills Kangdu, a gigantic set of scales appears behind him. That's a really awesome visual indicator. Anyway, at the risk of staying on this topic for far too long, as we move on, and Askin battles both Yoruichi and Yushiro, we end up in a spot where Askin's power has become much simpler, and frankly much more compelling, and it certainly makes for a better fight. By ingesting a lot of something and surviving, Askin can become immune to that substance. So here, we see Yushiro beating Askin up and unleashing his Shunko Bakuen Muso, but he fails to kill the Sternritter, and as a result, Askin becomes immune to Yushiro's attacks. Not only that, but with the fatal dose required going up enormously, Yushiro's power ends up having the opposite effect, and actually becomes good for Askin to ingest, allowing him to actively heal his wounds. There's no doubt about it, on the page this is ultimately much simpler and much more effective than the way the ability was demonstrated during the battle against Oetsu in chapter 602. By ingesting a lot of something, Askin can become immune to it. So it can't be used to kill him, and will in fact heal him from that point on. So really, what it boils down to is you have one chance to kill Askin with each of your individual abilities, essentially. Or even just on a person-by-person Reiatsu basis. But have you noticed something? We're talking much more about how the death dealing affects Askin himself, and much less about how Askin poisons his enemies. That's because, going back to the idea that I talked about a moment ago, the biggest change in the way the death dealing was written is how Askin uses his power to affect his targets. Again, the fundamentals don't change, but the idea that Askin can ingest something and then target his enemy with that same substance, it kind of goes away. Instead, Kubo shifts the focus to give Askin readable, visual, offensive abilities instead. Gift Ball, Gift Bad, Gift Ring, Gift Ball Deluxe. These essentially replace, or should I say transform, the way Askin poisons his foes, while he keeps the means of immunizing and protecting himself the same. What Kubo does is he takes a major problem that affects a lot of the Schrift, which is how abstract and how conceptual many of them are, without a correlating visual indicator to work with, and he manages to turn the death dealing into something that feels a lot more like your typical Bleach ability set. In a sense, it becomes something akin to the Heat, which is one of the most well-rounded and well-represented Schrift on the page, purely for that reason. It feels much more like a traditional Bleach moveset. Honestly, it is pretty cool, and I love what the ability eventually becomes. It goes from reading like a science textbook to actually looking awesome and being easy to follow for the average enjoyer. The death dealing grants Askin a variety of poison-themed attacks, while at the same time you have to kill him in a single hit, or he'll simply gain immunity to your attacks. Imagine if this is how the death dealing had been introduced against Oetsu. Maybe Askin throws a gift ball at the Zero Division member, Oetsu cuts it down, and then Askin simply says, "Now you've been poisoned." Poison and immunity. These are the two diametrically opposed cornerstones of the death dealing as an ability. To be honest, while I think that Askin has a great fight in the end, and I can't wait to see it in the anime of course, I wish a little more had been done to show his enemies actively trying to circumvent his immunity, as I think it presents a really interesting challenge, and ultimately it would have ended up in the same place anyway. I guess they do kind of do that, but my issue with it stems from the fact that rather than seeing Kisuke cooking up something clever, some kind of clever counter or way around this power on the fly, he just gets lucky that Yoruichi happens to have a transformation that will do it for him. So that was a bit more long-winded than I meant it to be, but I love Askin, and I've really been meaning to discuss the way I feel the depiction of his ability was changed, evolved, and streamlined over the course of the arc. In the end, it feels like Kubo successfully communicated what Askin could do, or half of it anyway, through his short sequence with Yushiro, when compared to an entire chapter with Oetsu. So the question is, how did Askin defeat Ichigo? Well, it should be obvious by now that Askin doesn't really play by the established rules of Bleach, and again, that's kind of the point of his character. Now, the manga doesn't really show us anything. Ichigo confronts Askin, who had earlier defeated Grimmjow with a single gift ball, and then by the time we see them again, Ichigo is lying face down on the floor, in a very infamous image. Of course, there was uproar in the community about this, but the truth is it makes perfect sense. Ichigo, while immensely powerful, is a very straightforward fighter, and so almost certainly just walked right into Askin's trap. I would have liked to have seen a bit more behind Ichigo's thought process though, to be totally honest. Did he not give any regard to the fact that this guy casually defeated someone of Grimmjow's caliber? In a sense, it's a little worse in the anime because Ichigo literally sees Askin standing over him. But truth be told, while the manga doesn't reveal how Askin bested the main character, it doesn't really matter, because we can surmise that Ichigo is probably defeated by any number of abilities, from Gift Ball to Gift Bad. In the manga specifically, Ichigo is in range of the Gift Bad when it reveals itself beneath Chad and Orihime. He kind of is too in the anime as well, so it's possible, and I would argue even likely, that that's what took him down. Either way, the key here is that Ichigo is exactly the kind of opponent that Askin relishes. Even if Ichigo is way stronger than him, the difference between them isn't significant enough to warrant any kind of Reiatsu negation. The reality is that Askin can defeat virtually anyone, so long as they play into his hands. If Kenpachi were to face Askin, we would see the same exact outcome. And to be honest, we did already see that outcome when Kenpachi rushed into battle Pernida. The anime adds an extra layer to the proceedings. In the anime's version of their battle, we see that Askin doesn't win quite so easily after all, which maybe allays some fears. Clearly trying to poison Ichigo, the Sternritter is sent flying backwards, and laments the fact that his power isn't working, that Ichigo isn't so easy to defeat, and he kind of knew it was going to be this way. Askin then asks Ichigo an interesting question, however, wondering if Ichigo spent time training in the royal palace with Osho, and if Ichigo picked up any weird techniques as a result. When Ichigo confirms that he did, Askin understands now why Ichigo isn't being affected by reishi poisoning, specifically saying that too, by the way. But he then notes that he now knows how to change up his formula, what he needs to do, and conjures a bunch of gift balls, ready to use them against Ichigo. Again, while it's never fully explained what this exchange exactly means, we can assume that Askin either simply makes his gift balls more potent to deal with the fact that Ichigo is even stronger than he first thought, or more likely, he actively changes up the concoction to affect someone who has already been exposed to reishi of this kind before. Think about it, the Quincy flood Varvelt with immense high-density reishi, and Askin later uses this same reishi to poison Chad and Orihime. But those two hadn't been to Ichibe's palace before, where he subjected Ichigo, Rukia, and Renji to incredibly dense and heavy reishi. I wonder if Ichigo's tolerance to the high-density reishi of Varvelt was simply so high that Askin had to dial it up if he wanted to poison Ichigo with reishi too. In the manga, we don't know what Askin poisons Ichigo with, though it's safe to assume it's reishi, only because that's what he then poisons Chad and Orihime with almost immediately after. In the anime, though, like I just said, he outright confirms that's what he's trying to do. I just find it intriguing that Askin specifically mentions Osho. We know that Yhwach is aware of Irazu Sandor, so I wonder if he passed that information down to Askin so as to kind of help him understand their enemy's various tolerances, and that due to training with Ichigo might already be more tolerant to high-density reishi than expected. I do have to wonder why Askin doesn't just slash himself and then poison his enemy's blood every single time. Because it's so easy to do, and he doesn't even seem to need to touch them with anything. That's the major difference. With Gift Ball and Gift Bad and Gift Ring, it seems like Askin needs to actually connect with these abilities to poison someone. And to be fair, it's already weird enough that he manages to hit a full health Yoruichi with the Gift Ball, which was off-screened in the manga, maybe we'll see it in the anime. But when it comes to him drinking his own blood after Oetsu cuts him, he's able to poison the Shinigami without even touching him. He does say in his battle with Kisuke that he's too much of a coward to cut his own arm off, which is fair enough, but that wasn't in relation to just using his blood to poison someone. Again, there's some weirdness surrounding how the death dealing was used, there's no doubt about it, and the fact that Askin doesn't use a substance on his person to poison his enemy ever again. Because Kubo changed how he depicted Askin poisoning his enemies. But as a result of all of this, it seems likely to me that Askin does defeat Ichigo with Gift Bad, even if the anime shows him conjuring a number of Gift Balls. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, but took something of value away from it as always as well. How does Askin's the death dealing work? Well, as I just explained, he's able to poison his enemies using any kind of substance he can, whether that's ingesting a substance and then use it on them, or simply by using one of his more traditional, more orthodox offensive abilities, and then even more interestingly, if he ingests a substance, he becomes immune to it, and it cannot be used against him ever again. It's a really powerful ability, really frankly totally broken, maybe not quite as broken as some of the even higher level Schrift, but this is definitely up there, and it's one of my favourites as well, especially how it was presented in Varvelt when it becomes a bit more creative in the way it actually appears on the page, the way it's actually visually drawn and brought to life, and I love seeing all of that, and it helps to give Askin a much more unique visual identity himself as well, which is always great too. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on the death dealing down in the comments below. What do you think about this Schrift? What do you think about this ability? How broken do you think it is? How powerful is this ability? Do you also think that Kubo changed the way this ability was depicted? He kept the fundamentals the same as to how the death dealing works, but he definitely, in my opinion anyway, shook up how it was presented on the page. But I'd love to get all of your thoughts down in the comments below, as well as how Askin defeated Ichigo too, the central question of the video itself. Let me know, I'd love to read them. Alright everyone, until next time, thank you again so very much for watching. Hit subscribe for more weekly Bleach content just like this. It helps support the channel enormously. Speaking of which, check out the Patreon as well, where you can become a member for as little as $1 a month. The $2 tier is the most popular one. But regardless, I want to give everyone who's helping me out there a huge thank you and a massive shout out. It really does mean the absolute world. Alright guys, well, until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.